Today I'll be ranking every single arc within Bleach. Now, there's not an official list that I used or anything like that. I separated it in a way that made the most sense to me. And if you don't jive with that, that's completely fine and you're more than welcome to complain about it. Also, I'm not someone who thinks that any of these arcs are bad by any means. I generally like the entire story of Bleach, but realistically, some are definitely worse than others. And with all that being said, let's jump right in. Coming in at number 10 in last place is the Fake Karakura Town arc. Now, this arc, like I said, it's not bad, but it does have one major strength that is also its major flaw, and that's the fact that it is packed full with fights that appeal to niches. Basically, what I'm saying is, if you like a specific character that's in the Gautier 13, that's a side character and doesn't really get much shine, then you'll probably like a portion of this arc. Like, even characters like Yumi Chika do get a specific fight all to themselves, even though they probably shouldn't have. But if you like Yumi Chika, you definitely appreciate the fact that that character got some spotlight. And it's all about niches across the board, because characters like Shuhei Hisagi got his own fight that a lot of people love, because the fight in the anime is one of the most well animated fights in Bleach. Me personally, I fall in the niche with Izuru Kira. I think his philosophy, his Zanpakuto, and his relationship and dynamic with Gin Ichimaru, the little bit of it that we see, I think it's all super interesting. And his fight, I thought, was just really cool, and I'm glad it happened. But this is a bit of a double-edged sword, and that's because it absolutely kills the pacing. The perspective is bouncing between countless different characters, whether that be captains that have more significant fights with the Espada, or lieutenants just fighting a Ronkar that aren't realistically up to par with any of the captains, and not really any of the lieutenants either. So the fights here are both a pro and a massive con, and that's what lands this arc in last place. Just dodging last place is the Arrancar invasion. This covers everything from the end of Soul Society to the beginning of Hueco Mundo. Now, if you just follow Ichigo's perspective, this arc would probably be a lot higher, because he trains with the Vizards, he fights Grimmjow twice. There's just a lot to appreciate with Ichigo's character here when it comes to a character writing standpoint. He has a lot of psychological issues he has to work through. And of course, there's the whole storyline with Orihime and how she basically just gets kidnapped and Ichigo has to go save her, which leads into Hueco Mundo. Like I said, from his perspective, this arc is excellent. It is very straightforward, and there's just a lot to really enjoy and, like I said earlier, appreciate. Unfortunately, the thing that drags this arc down the most is Toshido and the other Soul Reapers. Their fights absolutely suck. I'll talk about the exception here in a second, but specifically with Toshido, because I think he is the best example of why these fights suck, is both of his fights. He gets bullied throughout the entire thing due to a certain circumstance. He then one-shots the enemy. This is a very boring way to tell a fight, and this is why I dislike Toshido, or at least didn't like Toshido, for most of the manga up until the final arc. This is just a very poor way to do an arc, and with Toshido and most of the other Soul Reapers, this happens multiple times. And like I said, it's just not appealing, and I do think it drags the arc down significantly. But then we move on to the exception, Ikkaku. Now, there's so much that I like about Ikkaku as a character. He's just super funny. He has a great dynamic with Yumi Chika. There's a lot to really enjoy with his character, but specifically here, the appeal is his Bankai and the fight with the Arrancar. It's probably the best in the entire arc, and I say that because Grimmjow versus Ichigo, that's not really a fight. Even though it technically is, it's mostly Ichigo getting curb stomped, and as enjoyable as that was, I cannot say that it's a better fight than Ikkaku versus the Arrancar, because realistically, it is just not. I love this fight, and Ikkaku hard carried the Soul Reapers that came to help out Ichigo. Now, I absolutely had to make an individual point for Grimmjow. This is probably the entire reason this arc is not ranked number 10. Grimmjow is just that good. Specifically, his first appearance here, when he floats down, you see his spiritual pressure almost crushing and making Rukia feel just the sense of absolute fear before getting stabbed right in the stomach by Grimmjow. Not even his sword, his hand pierces straight through her. Grimmjow got inside of Rukia long before Renji did, and then right after, he proceeds to beat down Ichigo in one of the most insane moments that I think I've ever experienced. The memory is just so vivid to me. It is one of my most nostalgic memories when it comes to anime in general, and that's a big reason why I have so much love for this arc, and it's the whole reason I think that it's not number 10, because looking at it now, I feel like it should be one down, but I'll keep it at number 9. At number 8 is what I'm assuming a lot of people thought was going to be in last place, and that's the Fullbring arc. Now, something that I think goes super underappreciated, which is basically this entire arc, but specifically the psychological and mystery thriller aspects of this arc. The whole concept of taking Ichigo's main theme, his main ambition, and flipping it on its head to the point where all of his friends think that he is the bad guy at this point. I think that that concept alone is already really cool, and I think the execution is there. I really like how things were done here, and overall I think that people just do not appreciate that aspect of this arc enough. But this is ranked number 8 for a reason. The Fullbring arc does a lot of the core aspects that are very pivotal in Bleach. The training arcs, the fights, a lot of this just is not the best in this arc, especially compared to even the 2 arcs that I've mentioned already. The training arc in Fullbring, the whole thing with Ruruka, like Ruruka is a fine character. I'm not going to get too up in arms about her or anything like that, but the training sequences here just were not it. They pale in comparison to every other training sequence within Bleach. It's one of the aspects that I enjoy the most, and here there's just nothing I like. It wasn't entertaining at all. The Fullbringer's power system was just boring to learn about as well. We've already been introduced to so many different power systems in Bleach, and hearing about this one and learning about it just was more of a chore than anything else. It's like, sure, I have to know at least a decent amount about the Fullbring arc for this arc to really make sense, but I'm not doing it because I want to learn about their power system. It's purely out of necessity, which just, it sucks. Now, my opinion on the fights might give me a little bit of blowback because I don't hate them. You get a fight like Ichigo versus Ginjo, which is just awesome, and then you get a fight like Byakuya versus Tsukishima, which is also awesome, but for different reasons, because we get to see the full extent of Tsukishima's powers. We get to see it affect Byakuya, and then we get to see Byakuya's loyalty towards Ichigo just outweigh Tsukishima's ability, which was so wild, especially knowing the full extent of his ability. And as he kills Tsukishima, he just delivers one of the hardest quotes in all of Bleach. Tsukishima, after having a hole pretty much plunged through his chest, he says, "I saved your life, remember? Doesn't this make you feel bad?" To which Byakuya replies, "I do indeed owe my life to you. I am grateful, but you are Ichigo Kurisaki's enemy. Therefore, no matter whose life you saved, I will not hesitate in the slightest to kill you." And then there's Ikkaku versus Shishigawara. Now, this fight wasn't like the best or anything like that, but it was really funny and really entertaining. Just the two characters, the way that their personalities clashed, it just made the fight so much fun, and I really can't take off any points or anything like that because of it. Overall, I don't really see anybody hating on this fight specifically, and even when it comes to fights like Renji versus Dirty Boots, like, it's just a cool moment for Renji where he one-shots the opponent. He needed something like that. So overall, the fights here are not bad at all. Overall, this arc very similar to the last two. There's a duality with it where there's something very significant that is underappreciated, but then at the same time there are things that really do drag it down. It's super unfortunate, but that's just the way that things are. But I do like Fullbring better than the two arcs that I mentioned before. Everything But the Rain is an arc that I really do enjoy, but there's nothing really special about it. It's nice to learn a lot of lore and learning the secrets behind Ichigo's bloodline, his mother, Misaki, who was a Quincy, which everybody had pretty much speculated on for so long in the manga. Then we learn about Ishin and how he was the captain of the same squad that Matsumoto and Toshido are a part of, and he actually knew them very directly, which does bring up some questions about when they stayed at his house. But just kind of glossing over that, there's just a lot to really like about this arc. But like I said, I don't think it really does anything special. In fact, whenever it did have the opportunity to, like let's say showing off Ishin's Bankai or something just bombastic and cool like that, the opportunity is not taken. Now, given this excuse, or I guess this criticism, isn't exactly the greatest one on my part, because they literally just obey the rules of the universe. Ishin can't use his Bankai because it would affect the world of the living. That is something that is lore accurate. So my criticism here, it's not logical or anything like that, but still, Bleach ignores logic plenty of times, and I think right here would have been a good time to do it. Just outside the top 5 is the final assault. This is where all the cool fights happen. Kisuke, Yoruichi, Nell, Grimmjow versus Askin. This is one of the coolest fights in the series, and it gets rushed to absolute shit. I mean, we don't even know, for the longest time, we did not even know what happened to Grimmjow, Kisuke, and others. We didn't know if they were alive or what happened. And it took months, a very long time, for us to get confirmation that they were even alive. That is how much this story was rushed and how inconclusive a lot of these fights were. But even with all that being said, there were so many good fights here towards the end and so many epic moments that I think it still gets bolstered to this degree. And even then, the ending wasn't that bad. People really do over exaggerate with how things kind of turned out. A lot of people are just shippers, like people that wanted Ichigo and Rukia to be together. They were so up in arms that they burned books. That's how upset they were about the fact that their relationship that they wanted to happen did not happen. Now, I'm not going to say everybody that didn't like the ending is in that camp, because that is blatantly not true. But overall, the ending is not bad. It's not amazing, but it's still not nearly as bad as people make it out to be. Just breaking it into the top 5 is the Substitute Shinigami arc. Now overall, I think this arc has a super strong foundation where there's nothing really dragging it down. All that's really going on is that there's segments that are significantly better than the rest. This mostly has to do with Ichigo and Gren Fisher. The whole storyline between the two of them and how emotionally charged it is elevates their storyline so far above anything else that happens. And Ichigo versus Gren Fisher is arguably, and I would say 100% is the case, that this is the best and most important fight for Ichigo in the series. Not best in terms of the technicality, but it is the most important fight for Ichigo's character. And that's something I think you kind of have to appreciate. But then right after this, we get to the introduction of Renji and Byakuya, and Ichigo seemingly loses his powers, which leads directly into Soul Society. Just outside the top 3 is the Hueco Mundo arc. Now, the thing that everybody points out about this arc is that it's repetitive. It repeats a lot of the same story beats, or most of the story beats that exist within Soul Society. I'm not really going to try and argue against it, because I pretty much think it's a fact. So many similarities, it's not even worth arguing against, because I do agree pretty much completely. But what I don't agree on is how much of a problem it is. Because I deal with, or at least I've read through so many arcs in different series where it didn't bother me, and it doesn't bother me here either. Like, for example, if a One Piece fan tries to use this criticism and complain about how repetitive this arc makes Bleach, I'd probably laugh in their face, because One Piece, its formula, it's all super repetitive. There are so many different arcs to the point where it's probably more than 5, more than 8 maybe, because the arcs are a little bit smaller, and of course the series is longer. But there's so many arcs in that series that are repetitive, and so Bleach doing it a single time, going from Soul Society and then Hueco Mundo, repeating that arc one time, it's not a big deal to me. And it's not a big deal to me in One Piece either, to be fair. Like, it's something that kind of bothers me, but I love the formula there, just like I love the formula here. So the fact that Bleach, and specifically Hueco Mundo, is repetitive, does not bother me at all. The most obvious aspect that is amazing to this arc is Ichigo's fights and his overall storyline, the psychological issues he goes through due to White and the whole holification process he has gone through countless times now, and it's all gotten in the way of his spiritual pressure, which has led to him getting the brakes beaten off of him multiple times, whether it's by Yami or by Grimmjow twice. That is how messed up his spiritual pressure is due to these psychological issues. But starting off at the beginning of this arc with this fight with the Primera Espada, that's still a slept on fight, but in the grand scope of things, it's underrated for a reason. I mean, comparing it to Grimmjow versus Ichigo, where you have that rivalry that's built up over the span of 3 fights. In the first 2, where Ichigo just got the absolute dog beat out of him, it's easy to understand why this fight with the Primera Espada is very forgotten about. But like I said, with Ichigo versus Grimmjow, it is that rivalry aspect, and I like the dynamic here because the rivalry, it is not friendly. It's not Naruto and Sasuke or Goku and Vegeta, where there is this kind of friendly aspect to this rivalry. It is just straight up Grimmjow is a villain and Ichigo is the hero, and that is their dynamic. Now, of course, there's some stuff that you can extrapolate from it, pull from it, that's not necessarily on the surface level, because there is a certain demeanor to Ichigo that Grimmjow pulls out of him that no other antagonist necessarily does. But of course, what everybody remembers from this arc is Ichigo going into his Vasta Lorde form versus Ukiura. There's just so many fantastic elements to this fight. The storytelling here with both Ichigo and Ukiura, and even involving Orihime, it's all just fantastic, and I absolutely love this arc from this perspective. Just here to correct a mistake really quick, I said Primera Espada when it's actually Privaron, so just keep that in mind. It is a mistake I made. Moving on. Just making the top 3 is Turn Back the Pendulum. Now, I absolutely love flashback arcs. It is my bread and butter. Any flashback arc in my book is getting automatic bonus points for just giving that extra context behind so many characters that we probably love. And that's definitely the case for this arc. And it just so happens in Bleach that all of these flashback arcs, they're pretty short, so the pacing is just on point. Tonally, I absolutely love this arc. On the surface, it does seem a lot brighter, and you can kind of see what the Soul Society was like at this specific point in time, a long time before Ichigo ever got there. So I do think on the surface it seems a lot brighter, but of course, given that Aizen is a prominent figure within this arc and we're learning what happened to the Vizards to make them that way and what got Kisuke kicked out of Soul Society, it all ends up with this dark undertone that I think fits this arc perfectly. Now, this arc doesn't necessarily have amazing fights, as it has more amazing moments. We see what made the Vizards what they are and how they're kind of just like a failed experiment in a way. And then there's some cooler lighthearted stuff like Kisuke jumping out of the way of Hiyori's kick and then jumping right back into it, just showing her that he could have definitely dodged the move if he wanted to. There's so many moments like that that are super engraved into my memory from this arc, and it's part of the reason that I love it, and I can go back to it at really any point in time. Now, of course, I can't talk about this arc without talking about Aizen. And one of the moments that I forgot to mention is Shinji noticing that Aizen was there. It just seemed like such a raw moment in showing that there are competent characters that did kind of get an idea of the type of character that Aizen was, even if they didn't have a full grasp on who and what exactly he was. But I did get a little bit sidetracked there. I was talking about Aizen, specifically seeing him at this point in time, getting a little bit of backstory here. Given that we don't ever really get a proper backstory for Aizen, this is really all we have to go off of. So it is nice to see him, to see Tozen, to see Gin, all of them kind of coming together and seeing what they did to the visors, what they did to Kisuke. It all just wraps together and comes together very nicely. It's like getting a present wrapped in a nice, neat little bow. That is the best way I could possibly describe this arc. And bringing home the silver is the First Assault, the Blood War arc part 1. Before there started to be real pacing issues due to a rushed ending, this arc was absolutely fantastic, and I felt the need to kind of separate the two before everything kind of started to get rushed. Now, given that this is before everything gets rushed, there is no pacing problems here. Everything happens, I think, at a very proper pace. None of the fights are really dragged out or anything like that. And Ichigo coming back when he did, it all fit so perfectly within this storyline that Kubo told. I think that this arc has nearly the best pacing in the entire series. Nearly. And I talked about the tone in the last one where it did have that little bit of a brighter feel with a darker undertone. This, it's maybe the opposite, is putting it a little bit of a nice way, because there doesn't necessarily seem to be a bright undertone or anything like that. It's mostly just a very dark battle shonen arc. You can see this in the way that the anime presents it, because there's not a lot of censoring really anywhere, which I personally just absolutely love to see. It does seem pretty goofy looking back on the original series now, to where he's spitting up blood, but in the anime they do slobber and stuff like that. It just works so much better here. But of course, I'm still mostly talking manga, and it is noticeably darker in this arc than any of the arcs beforehand, and I do think it works perfectly well, given that this is a war arc. There is a quote that I absolutely love coming from this arc at the very beginning, funnily enough from pretty unknown and forgettable character, where he says, "Wars happen because both sides are just." This seems like a Shunsui quote, but it's just some random dude in the healing division. But I just love this quote because it perfectly encapsulates the tone of this arc. Now, the fights here are great. They do not slack in any real way, but I do think that they kind of pale in comparison, as opposed to the final assault, where we get fights like Sajin versus Bombietta, Kenpachi versus Grimmy, Kisuke, Yoruichi, and Grimmjow versus Askin. Like, those fights I think are significantly better than anything we get here, but it is just crazy seeing all the Sternritters just mow through the captains that we've pretty much seen to be so powerful at this point. I do have to address some stupidity really quick. Now, not stupidity as in people are criticizing and their criticism is dumb. Just Kubo did a couple of oopsies that I think were oversights on his part. And if they were intentional, I don't think that they landed very well. Now, the first one, this is the most obvious one that you've probably seen brought up time and time again, is that an imposter for Yuha beat up Kenpachi, and then of course he fights on a scale comparable to that of Yamamoto. And then of course you get Yamamoto's death, where it reveals that, hey, Yuha was not actually dead, he's right behind you. And then of course you get Yamamoto cut in two, and overall it just felt very underwhelming, and it did feel cheap. Now, I don't think it ruins his death by any means or anything like that. It was still a really cool fight where we got to see his Bankai, but like I said, it did feel cheap. And lastly, something I have never seen anybody bring up that bothers me so much: when Byakuya is fighting Asnot, he doesn't use any Kido after his Bankai is stolen. I don't know if there's a rule in the universe saying that somehow after his Bankai got stolen he can't use Kido, but if he's fighting at a disadvantage with his Shikai, which is just an objectively weaker version of his Bankai, he should be using Kido. It makes the most sense. It would have made the fight so much cooler, and his overall loss feels so much more hopeless because he did exhaust all of his options. Him not using Kido just absolutely sucks to me. And surprising absolutely no one is at number 1, the Soul Society. Now, I do think that this is the best arc in all of shonen. There's not an arc in Naruto, One Piece, Dragon Ball, or any other shonen that I can think of that bests this arc. There are arcs that I would consider kind of in that same tier: Sasuke Retrieval, Water 7 Enies Lobby, where I do think that they are comparable, but I do think that Soul Society is at least a couple of steps ahead. I think the gauntlet style of fighting, where it's almost like Ichigo is building his way up all the way to where he can finally fight Byakuya as this kind of final boss character, I think it just works incredibly well. And mixing this with the mystery aspect of the entire arc, like I said, it all blends together and it works out in the best way possible. There's amazing storytelling and fights all around. I mentioned in so many arcs, and pretty much every single arc beforehand, there is some fight, there is some aspect of the storytelling that drags the arc down. I can't think of a single one where that's the case in this arc. It doesn't have any noticeable weaknesses to me, not a single one. I mean, just following Ichigo's storyline, where he starts off fighting characters like Ikkaku, where it's a great fight on its own, and then constantly leveling up throughout the arc, fighting characters like Renji, Kenpachi, going on to Byakuya, to getting absolutely bodied by Aizen. That's this gauntlet style that I was talking about. And then of course you have the side characters like Chad. He doesn't do really much cool in this arc, but he does go up against Shunsui, which that's just bad luck. You can't really blame him for that. Then of course I've already mentioned this one, but Uryu versus Mayuri is one of the sleeper hits, I would say, from this arc, where it is an absolute fantastic moment for Uryu, and I would say his best moment in the entire series, and overall one of my favorite fights of the arc. And then there's even stuff like Kenpachi versus Tosen, where he can't really do anything to Tosen, so he has to let Tosen stab him so he can finally end up winning the fight. And overall, I just love what Kubo did with the side characters and how well paced everything was, despite the constantly switching perspectives. Like I said, just in almost every single aspect that I could possibly judge from, this arc absolutely kills it. Now, all of this makes it one of the best arcs in all of Shonen, but the twist at the end is what really seals the deal for me, making it number one. Because if you did not see this coming whenever you first watched Bleach, it is one of the most shocking events that you've probably ever experienced in any anime or manga outside of the eclipse. And that is just how much of a twist this moment actually was. And it's not just the fact that it's a great twist that you didn't see coming. You go back and you read the Soul Society arc over again, and you see the type of character Aizen is and the facade that he's putting up, and you just think about how clever he is throughout the entire reread of this arc, and how fantastic of a manipulator he is, controlling characters like Gin, which just the entire story arc of Gin starts here, where he is presented as this very evil character, and then of course you know what happens at the very end of his story arc. And then even a character like Tozen, who has a very strong sense of duty, to find out that he, as well as Aizen, who was this very nice guy, they're all traitors. That is going to be pretty much it though. I plan for these videos to be about 10 minutes long, and they end up being about 20 minutes long because I just end up talking a lot. But as for what to expect in the future, 20th Century Boys video is next in terms of what I'll be writing down. There might be something in between then, just as a kind of off-the-cuff type video, but that is the next one I have planned and will be actively working towards. After that, probably something like Blue Exorcist. I've read a decent amount of that. World Trigger's another one, and maybe even a Boruto one, because there's a lot of changes that went down that are pretty interesting to talk about, even though I don't necessarily like them. I like complaining, so that video will probably happen as well. I'm once again rambling, so that's going to be it. Thank you guys for watching, and I'm out.